Hi guys, Mr. Pease here. I hope you guys are all well. Thank you for all your feedback regarding your progress on your coursework. Much appreciated. Um, so before half term, we focused on recapping Othello as a tragedy, the play, the genre as a tragedy itself. Today we're going to focus a little bit more, one of two parts, on Othello as the protagonist. Okay? First of all, though, I asked you to learn certain key quotes, about 60 or so. And what I'd like you to do is don't look at your notes. I've given you a couple of prompts here in terms of the character and the scene, or the critic, for number 6. And what I'd like you to do is pause the video, copy and complete those quotes. Okay, very well done. Answers as follows. First one, I follow him to serve my turn upon him. From Iago's significant one of his speeches in Act 1, Scene 1. Desdemona's staked independence and her free spirit of Act 1. Let me go with him, she says to the powerful Senate. Iago's soliloquy from Act 2, Scene 1. The thought whereof doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw my inwards. Talking about the notion of Othello having done his office. Number 4 from Act 1, Scene 1, it's part of that motiveless malignity, horribly stuffed with epithets of war, attempting to establish Othello as an arrogant character. Number 5, rude am I in my speech, the arguably racial frailty coming through in Othello in Act 1, Scene 3. And then finally the post-colonial reading from that excellent critic Singh, Othello self-destructively internalizes the prevailing racism, a post-colonial reading. Okay, good, important, because it's a close text section of the exam to know those quotes off by heart. Okay, one more though. Last time we talked about tragedy. What I'd like to do is like you to pause the video. Of course, for some of those questions, there's more than one answer. Okay, so pause the video, have a go at answering those 5 questions, please. Alright, great. So what's important about the protagonist to enable catharsis? So they have to be realistic and the audience are able to identify with them. Because if we can't identify with their struggle and recognise that it could happen to us if we were to make terrible errors as well, then we're going to struggle to achieve catharsis in the Aristotelian sense. Okay? The classical tragedy hero is usually of noble personage, i.e. of noble birth itself, king, queen, royalty, that kind of shenanigans. 2 most important principles of tragedy according to Aristotle, plot and character, with plot being deemed the most important. One way that Othello deviates from the classical tragedy is a play. It doesn't fully observe the unities of time, place and action. But of course there are other answers you could have had there. You could have focused on how Othello doesn't conform to the tragic hero as well, amongst other bits and pieces. Number 5, recall one way the protagonist Othello deviates from the classical tragical hero. Of course, he is not nobility in the traditional sense. So moving on today then, from Othello the play to Othello the character. Okay? And there are 3 big questions I want to pose and consider today. What defines the classical tragic hero, which we touched upon last time and I've touched upon within Year 12 itself. Secondly, how far does Othello conform to the classical tragic hero? And thirdly, what do the critics say? So, without further ado, first one, what defines the classical tragical hero? Or the tragic hero, rather. So, Aristotle, significant influence upon modern critical views itself as defining in his work Poetics the classical tragic hero. And there are these big things that really defined him. A hero of reputation and wealth who is great of heart but makes a fatal error of judgment and endures a reversal of fortune. So, really high in society, really prosperous, a good person, but they make a terrible error, and that endures a reversal of all the things they've achieved. But also importantly, Aristotle did make clear that they actually have to be accessible and realistic. They have to be an intermediate kind of personage. So they have to be good, but not too morally good or perfect. Else we're going to struggle to identify with them because they transcend the realm of humanity if they're too good, don't they? A tragic hero's misfortune is from an error of judgment and not immorality or vice/sin. And I think that's really important. They're not fundamentally evil and nasty people. This is actually from a mistake they make that leads towards the kind of tragic conclusion of the play. And it's important to help us build a rapport because we are all fallible and we can all make mistakes in essence. And also, finally, the tragic hero, their struggle is against an overwhelming fate, and their victory is so noble that they achieve a moral victory over the forces that destroy them. So despite it ending in their death, they achieve a sense of victory, particularly a moral victory over the forces of fate or destiny that were kind of turning against them. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is go back to that slide and summarize the classical tragic hero on a bullet point list of overall having no more than 20 words. So that one there, okay? So no more than 20 words. Can you summarize all of that? Okay, next. So now we've got a sense of how Aristotle defines a tragic hero. Next, we're going to think about Othello. Othello, the protagonist. How far does he conform to the classical tragic hero? Okay, pause the video now and write down some notes answering the above question. So it's really important to know, we've talked a lot about race and Othello, and I won't be dealing with race today, because that needs a whole lesson in itself, because it's such a significant part of this play and the enduring nature of how people have responded to the play. So we're going to deal really comparing Othello from the classical tragic hero to the Shakespearean tragic hero, okay? Alright, so he's a really fascinating character, I think. Very interesting, very complex, because, you know, he's a general, so he's got that high military rank in the army, but in terms of a tragic status, he's not a European king or European nobleman. So in a way, he's much more of an everyman than most of Shakespeare's other tragic heroes, such as Hamlet or King Lear or even Macbeth. So what Othello has is military power. Okay, so he has the power which has been conferred on him by Venetian society, but he has no status, he has no standing amongst the Venetian elite in themselves because of his colour and race. His life and being is not European. He's a black man and more was sold to slavery. However, he does have a sense of foreign or otherness and a nobility that comes with that, because he's foreign royalty technically, or supposedly it's alluded to at points within the text. And as a culture was deemed exotic and mysterious and extraordinary, symbolised with that whole speech of the Sibyl weaving the magic into the handkerchief itself. But irrespective of that, he is always an outsider to European culture. So it's a bit like he's been allowed to belong in power terms because he's such an effective general, but he's never been allowed to fully belong because he's black, because he's an outsider. But irrespective of all of that, he is a worthy hero. Iago tries to blacken his name at the start of the play, and although he tries to establish an arrogance and pride to Othello, and there's a kind of the maligning him that happens in Act 1, Scene 1. When we actually meet Othello for the first time in Act 1, Scene 2, he is measured, dignified and commanding. To elevate that status further, Shakespeare gives a musical language. He is so poetic in the way that he speaks, and it's beautiful poetry that Shakespeare gives him to elevate him as a character, to show his inner spirit and morality as a character. But also alongside that, of course, like the other tragic heroes, he has a fatal flaw: jealousy. Arguably jealousy. There are various frailties, I think, within Othello, sadly, which Iago exploits to the full. But his flaw connects Othello with audiences, because who might have also felt that stab of the green-eyed monster. So actually, in a way, Othello's fate is quite likely to inspire pity and fear because of that ability to identify with that flaw within him. Finally, his fall from nobility and grace is where he goes from so poetic and so beautifully poetic to obscene and offensive prose, kind of mirroring Iago's patterns of speech itself. At the end of the play, he does understand how he's been wrought upon. He does have the realization. It could be argued that his tragic stature rises right at the end when he realizes what he's thrown away in that love for Desdemona and the quality of that love that they shared. Whether we finally sympathise with him, though, it really is debatable. Some mourn his death, seeing something heroic in the way he acknowledges the shame of his conduct. Other critics and other audience members struggle with the level of murder that he's committed and the willful murder that he commits in that respect itself. and the way that he talks about himself at the end, really, as Levis suggests. And it's more about how he'll be remembered. Okay, so that was a lot there itself. So let's try and summarize that down into some key tenets, okay? How far does Othello conform to the classical tragic hero? So, he's not a noble personage in a traditional classical hero sense, but he does have power as a general. So he's not nobility, but he's high up in society in some way. But while he's got that power, he also has this peculiar frailty in that society because he has no status, because he's a marginalised outsider to European culture. So it's a really complex protagonist we're being confronted with by Shakespeare. When we meet Othello in Act 1, he is presented as great of heart. He's morally good, and that shines through in his reactions to Brabantio's really, really horrifically racist attack on him. He's dignified, measured, and commanding. Shakespeare maybe further elevates Othello's tragic hero credentials because of the beautifully poetic language that he renders Othello with. Hamartia is arguably his jealousy, rendering him an imperfect, identifiable character, important for the audience's eventual catharsis. His fall comes from a significant error of judgment, a terrible error of judgment, and is of great cost to him and Desdemona and all the others who die in the play. His realization during the end of the play goes some way to restoring his humanity, certainly his poetry at least, so there seems to be an intent there to convey that. So you could say, in a way, he does quite clearly conform to the classic tragic hero in many ways, with some notable differences as listed above. So what I'd like you to do is consider this. We've talked about it in class before. The end of the play. It's difficult as a modern audience, I think, to fully sympathise with Othello. And whilst we find the actions he's committed as morally abhorrent and shocking, as I said at the time, I'm still much more emotionally wrought by the end of Othello than I am by, perhaps, say, the end of Macbeth. So, does Shakespeare successfully restore Othello's humanity at the end of the play? Pause the video and answer that question and front your answer with Shakespeare. Okay, so moving on. What do the critics say? So try and recall any critical quotes at all, any critics' views of the character, and any literary theoretical position. I'm going to go through kind of 5 or 6 here that I want you to do something with, but I'm running out of time, so I've got to be quick. So what I have on this following 2 slides are statements from essays, in essence, or interviews about the play Othello. For each one, I'd like you to write how far you agree with it, using his arguable sentence and using not only but also a sentence. We've seen these before, so it is a bit of a recap activity, but it was a while ago. So here they all are. So I'm not going to go through them because I don't have time for that. You're only allowed 15 minutes. So I want you to read them and I want you to answer the questions that come after it itself. Okay. We've got Coleridge, C.L.R. James, Ben Ockery, Helen Gardner, Kiernan Ryan, and Jyotsna Singh. Okay, a varied view that's on it itself, and we'll talk more explicitly about the race aspect of the play next week. But what I'd like you to do, once you've paused the video and gone through those 2 slides, is to think about, of those 6 offered there, which one do you most identify with and why? What is it about that view that you can recognise as most identifying with your own view of Othello the character? Okay. So guys, that's the end of Othello, the protagonist in the classical tragical hero sense. What I'd like to do next is develop your notes using today's PowerPoint. Next week we're going to revisit Othello and race, okay, because that's hugely important in our understanding of the play. And also keep reading and researching for coursework and update myself and Mrs. Heck regularly. And thank you for the updates you've sent so far. So take care of yourselves, guys, and see you soon.